The quiet struggle. Mara Caldwell's eyes lingered on the chipped coffee mug before her. The dull, faded ceramic bore a tiny crack along its rim, a mark that reflected the passage of time. It had been her companion for years, from the early mornings when she'd sat alone, sipping her coffee before the world fully awoke, to the chaotic afternoons spent rushing between work and family. It was a simple object, but to Mara, it was as much a part of her life as the clothes she wore or the air she breathed. She watched the steam rise from the mug and wondered, not for the first time, how things had gotten so hard. She hadn't always been this way, hadn't always been this tired, worn, and resigned to a life of struggle. There had been days when hope seemed within reach, when she could almost taste it. But now, at 61, those days seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the sharp reality of bills, debts, and the relentless grind of factory life. Mara set the mug down and rubbed her face with both hands, feeling the weight of another day settling in her bones. The apartment, dim and quiet, was a reflection of her own fatigue. The walls, peeling and faded, had once been painted a soft yellow, but over the years, time had stripped them of their warmth, leaving only reminders of the past. The old radiator by the window clanged occasionally, struggling to keep the place warm. It was never enough, never as comforting as it should be. She stood and made her way toward the small kitchen counter, her footsteps deliberate but slow. Each movement felt like a burden, her body protesting against the years of hard labor. The arthritis in her knees, the tension in her back, and the dull ache in her wrists were her constant companions, as familiar to her as the air she breathed. But what could she do? Work was a necessity, and there was no time for weakness. Her daughter, Sarah, had long since left the house, her own life now taking shape in a different part of the city. She had her own struggles, her own burdens to bear. But Mara understood, she always had. For years, Mara had been the pillar of her family, the one who held everything together, even when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about making sure her family had what they needed, that they were never without. And though Sarah had left, the unspoken responsibility Mara felt toward her daughter, and now toward her 2 grandchildren, never wavered. The morning passed slowly. By the time the clock on the kitchen wall read 7 a.m., Mara had already dressed, prepared her lunch, and called her daughter to check in. Sarah, of course, had already left for her job as a nurse at the local clinic. The world, it seemed, was moving faster than Mara could keep up with. But there was no time to ponder that now. She was already late for the factory, where another long day awaited. Mara grabbed her worn leather jacket from the hook near the door, feeling the familiar weight of it as she slipped it on. She gave one last glance at the room, its tired, familiar furnishings, and then stepped outside into the sharp morning air. The first thing that hit her was the cold, biting and unforgiving. It was still early, and the streets were empty except for a few cars creeping along the road, their headlights cutting through the dark. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she walked down the street toward the bus stop. Her shoes, well-worn and barely holding together, made soft thuds on the cracked pavement. The sound was the only noise that seemed to break the stillness, her own breath coming out in little puffs of mist. She had long stopped noticing the worn state of the streets or the crumbling buildings that lined her route. They had become part of the landscape, part of the city that, for all its faults, had become her home. Mara reached the bus stop just in time for the 7:15 a.m. bus, the one that took her to the outskirts of the industrial district where the factory stood. She climbed aboard, her movements slow and measured. The bus was mostly empty this time of day, save for a few other workers, all heading in the same direction. They were the invisible class, the ones who powered the gears of the city without ever being noticed. They were the ones who made things run but never got to enjoy the fruits of their labor. The driver, a young man with a tired face, barely glanced at her as she boarded. She offered him a small, polite smile, but he was already focused on the road, his eyes glazed with the same exhaustion that mirrored her own. They were all the same, she thought. All of them, struggling to survive, to keep moving forward, even when it seemed impossible. The ride to the factory was short but uncomfortable. The bus bounced along the rough road, and Mara held onto the metal pole to steady herself. Outside, the city was just beginning to wake up. The factory loomed in the distance, a hulking structure of concrete and steel. It looked the same every day, sturdy, imposing, indifferent to the people who worked within its walls. The bus arrived at the factory gate, and Mara stepped off, taking a moment to gather herself before heading toward the entrance. She passed the security guard, a man named Tim, who gave her a nod but said nothing. It was the unspoken rule here, no one spoke much. Everyone was too busy, too tired, too focused on getting through the day. Mara didn't mind. She had long since learned to keep her head down and do the work. Inside, the factory was alive with noise, the clanging of machines, the hum of assembly lines, the constant buzz of activity. It was a place that never stopped, a place that thrived on the exhaustion of its workers. And Mara was no different. She found her station on the assembly line and began her day. The repetitive motions. Screwing parts into place, checking for defects, repeating the same tasks over and over, were a kind of rhythm she had long since learned to live with. The work was draining, both physically and mentally, but it paid the bills. At least, it did for now. Her supervisor, Mark, a tall man in his mid-40s, walked by and gave her a brief glance. He was the type of boss who rarely smiled and never said much, preferring to stand in the background and watch his workers with a sense of cold detachment. He had always been that way. But Mara was used to it. She didn't expect kindness from him, she didn't expect anything, really. She bent over her workstation, focusing on the task at hand, when a voice interrupted her concentration. It was deep, commanding, and unmistakable. Mara, right? She turned to see him standing there, Gerald Grant, the CEO of the factory. His presence was enough to make the room feel smaller. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that looked out of place in a factory like this. His eyes were cold and calculating, a man who had always been able to separate himself from the workers, the ones who actually made his wealth possible. Mara, he repeated, his voice now more forceful. I need to speak with you. Mara felt a pang of unease in her chest. What could he possibly want with her? He rarely interacted with the workers. As far as she knew, he had no interest in their lives beyond their ability to produce. But still, she couldn't avoid him. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him to the side, out of earshot from the other employees. The noise of the factory faded slightly as they moved away from the machines. I've been watching your performance, Grant said, his eyes narrowing slightly. You've been working here a long time, haven't you? Mara nodded, her heart beating faster now. Something about his tone didn't sit right with her. You're a dedicated worker, he continued, his words carrying a certain detached praise. But you're not getting any younger. And I'm starting to wonder if your time here is, well, if it's really in your best interest. Mara swallowed, trying to keep her composure. She didn't know what he meant, but it didn't sound good. She had worked here for decades, and now, suddenly, he was questioning her place. The secrets we keep. Mara's heart raced as Gerald Grant's words hung in the air, heavy and laden with unspoken implications. She stood there, staring at him for a moment, trying to piece together what he was implying. The factory, the job she had held for nearly 4 decades, was all she knew. The stability it provided, though never luxurious, had kept her family afloat. And now this man, who, to her, had always seemed like an unreachable entity, a figure that never bothered with the workers except when things went wrong, was questioning her? Her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied them against her apron, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. I don't understand, sir, she said, her voice calm despite the rising panic inside. What do you mean, my time here? She looked up at him, seeing him through the lens of years of labor, every callus on her hands a silent testament to her loyalty, to her struggle. Gerald Grant studied her for a moment, his cold, calculating eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if weighing her words. "What I mean is that I've noticed you've been slowing down," he said, the words laced with a quiet condescension. "And I can see it's taking a toll on you. The long shifts, the double hours. You're pushing yourself harder than anyone else here, but at what cost? You're not young anymore, Mara." Her stomach twisted, a mixture of indignation and resignation rising inside her. "I'm just doing my job," she replied, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "Like I always have." Gerald gave a dismissive nod, almost as if he were indulging her, his gaze flickering past her as though he were already thinking about something else. "Yes, I've noticed that. But everyone has their limits, don't they?" His words stung, like a slap to her face. Her mind raced, and the old familiar ache in her joints flared up as if to remind her of the reality she lived in, a reality that no one else seemed to understand. "I've worked for you long enough to know that I have a job to do. That's all I'm concerned with," Mara said, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. But Gerald wasn't done. "I'm not questioning your work ethic, Mara," he said, his tone more condescending now. "But the fact is, I'm making some changes around here, and well, let's just say you're not the youngest employee we have. I don't want you to burn yourself out. It's just not worth it." The air between them felt thick, and for the first time in years, Mara could feel the weight of her age creeping up on her. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion, the aching muscles, the joint pain, it was the invisible toll that decades of work had taken on her sense of self. She had always been strong, always known that her value lay in her ability to endure, to push through the pain. But now, standing here, facing Gerald Grant's clinical assessment of her age and diminishing value, she felt small. She felt seen only for her limitations and not for the years of unrecognized sacrifice she had made for this company. "I've worked hard for this company, Mr. Grant," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "And I'm not about to let someone tell me when I've hit my limit." Gerald's eyes flickered briefly, and for the first time, Mara saw a hint of something like guilt or discomfort, cross his face. But it was gone in a flash, replaced once again by the same cold, calculating demeanor. He adjusted his tie, glancing at the clock. "I suppose we'll see. But I'm serious, Mara. I don't want to see you burn out. There are other opportunities here. You don't have to work yourself into the ground." With that, he turned and walked away without another word, leaving Mara standing there, her mind reeling. She was left alone in the quiet space by the assembly line, the noise of the factory seemingly more distant now. She felt small, insignificant. Gerald Grant, the man who owned this place, didn't see her as a person. He saw her as a cog in the machine, someone whose purpose had an expiration date. Mara took a deep breath, trying to center herself, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled deep within her chest. She knew better than to let the words of someone like him penetrate too deeply, but the truth was undeniable, her body was tired. She had been working double shifts for weeks now, ever since the company had imposed new quotas and tighter deadlines. But she couldn't afford to stop. She couldn't afford to let up. Not when there was so much at stake. Her daughter, Laura, had been asking her to slow down for months. The worry in her voice was impossible to ignore. "Mom, you're not getting any younger. You need to take care of yourself," Laura had said on more than one occasion, her eyes pleading with her mother to listen. But Mara couldn't. Not yet. The bills were piling up, the rent overdue, and her daughter had 2 young children to care for. There was no time for slowing down. The unseen struggle. That afternoon, after her shift ended, Mara found herself walking along the familiar path to the small corner store down the street. The factory gate had closed behind her, and the workers had dispersed in all directions, their tired faces reflecting the same exhaustion she felt. As she walked, she noticed the same streetlights buzzing above, their yellow glow casting long shadows on the cracked pavement below. The evening air was cool now, but it did little to soothe the burn in her muscles, the constant ache in her back. The small convenience store was just around the corner from her apartment, a place she had frequented for years. She could barely remember the last time she had bought anything that wasn't strictly necessary. Her eyes scanned the shelves as she walked down the narrow aisles, looking for something to snack on, a small comfort after the long day. She grabbed a loaf of bread and some cheese, thinking about what she would cook for dinner later. Her stomach growled, but it wasn't hunger that gnawed at her, it was something deeper, something that she hadn't acknowledged until now. As she reached the checkout counter, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fished it out and saw Laura's name on the screen. "Hey, Mom," Laura's voice was tired, but there was a hint of urgency in it. "I've been talking to a few people about getting you some help around the house. Maybe a nurse or a home aide, someone to help with the groceries, the housework. You don't have to do everything alone." Mara felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm fine," she replied, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Just been a long day. You don't need to worry about me." But Laura persisted. "Mom, you've been working double shifts. You're not fine. I can see it, and I know you can, too. You're not a superhero, you don't have to do it all." Mara couldn't respond. She just stared at the checkout counter, her fingers pressing into the edges of the bread in her hands. The idea of help, of slowing down, felt foreign to her, almost like an admission of defeat. But what would happen if she didn't? If she pushed herself too far? What was the point of all this work if it only left her broken? After a long pause, she muttered, "I'll think about it, honey. I promise." As she hung up the phone and paid for her groceries, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through her fingers, something she had fought so hard to keep from losing. The weight of Gerald Grant's words lingered, his dismissal of her efforts and his cold indifference to her life. But that was just the beginning. What he didn't know was that Mara had a secret, something she had never shared with anyone, not even her daughter. The story of Mara's hidden struggle was far from over. Each day was a fight, against her body, against time, and now, against the reality of her own fading strength. But in the quiet of her soul, something began to stir. Maybe there was more to life than just surviving. Maybe, just maybe, the truth that Mara had kept hidden for so long was the key to finding her own peace. And as she walked back home that evening, the hum of the city around her, the weight of her choices heavy on her mind, she couldn't help but wonder if things would ever be the same. The tipping point. The days blurred together for Mara in a haze of exhaustion. Each morning, the same routine, waking before the sun, the faint groan of the radiator in the early morning cold, the cup of black coffee, the slice of dry toast. Each night, the same fatigue, her joints aching, her bones worn, but her mind focused on the long hours ahead. The work had become second nature, her body moving on autopilot, until the physical exhaustion began to set in deeper. It wasn't just the tiredness in her legs, the throbbing in her back, or the soreness in her hands from gripping tools for hours on end. No, it was the weight in her chest, the suffocating feeling that came from knowing that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she sacrificed, there was no reward waiting for her at the end. It wasn't enough to put food on the table or keep the lights on, she had learned that long ago. But it was all she had left. Mara's daughter, Laura, had been persistent in her attempts to get her mother to slow down, but Mara had always deflected the concern, always brushed off her daughter's worry with a small smile and a change of subject. She couldn't afford to stop, not when every dollar counted, not when her family depended on her. Yet deep down, Mara knew Laura was right. She was no longer the woman she used to be. Her body had changed, her strength had faded, and she had begun to notice it in the most unsettling ways. The mornings were the hardest. The stiffness in her joints was worse, her muscles aching in ways they never had before. By the time her shift ended, she was barely able to move, and yet there was always something else waiting, another errand to run, another responsibility to take care of. The physical toll was only the surface of the problem. Beneath it, there was something deeper, a gnawing emptiness she hadn't dared to confront. Her conversations with Laura had become more frequent, more insistent. "Mom, please. You don't need to work yourself to death. We'll find a way to get by. Let me help." But Mara, ever the stubborn woman, had refused to listen. She had built a wall around herself, a barrier of pride and necessity. She didn't want to admit that she was at her breaking point. That was until one afternoon, when everything changed. It had been one of those days when the factory floor felt like an endless sea of noise, the machines roaring in her ears, the smell of oil and metal thick in the air. Mara had barely made it through the morning without feeling dizzy, the pounding headache in the back of her skull never quite fading. The constant rhythm of the assembly line had been a blur as she worked her way through the hours, her body feeling heavier with every movement. By the time the clock finally ticked down to the end of her shift, she could feel the weight of the day pulling her down. She stood, rubbing her aching temples, and glanced at the door to the break room. There, standing in the doorway, was Gerald Grant. His usual suit and tie looked out of place in the industrial setting, his presence almost surreal among the workers. He didn't belong here, not in this world of labor and sweat. Mara's stomach turned at the sight of him, but she kept her head down, pretending not to notice. She had no desire to interact with him, not after the conversation they had a few days ago. But as she began to walk past him, his voice stopped her in her tracks. "Mara," Gerald called, his tone not quite friendly but not entirely cold either. "I need to talk to you." Mara froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight. Gerald didn't seem to notice the strain in her voice as he gestured to a small alcove near the office. "It'll just take a minute," he said, walking away without waiting for her response. Against her better judgment, Mara followed him, her footsteps slow and hesitant. They stood in the quiet alcove, a small space away from the noise of the factory floor. Gerald turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I've been watching you," he said simply. His voice had an almost clinical tone, as if he were examining an object rather than a person. Mara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "What do you want?" she asked, her words a little sharper than she intended. Gerald didn't seem fazed. "I've noticed you've been working a lot of overtime. More than usual. And I've seen you struggle with the load. You're not as quick as you used to be." Mara's heart hammered in her chest. Was he really questioning her ability? After all these years of loyalty, of hard work, was he going to throw her out like some broken machine? "I'm fine," she said through gritted teeth, refusing to show the vulnerability she could feel rising inside her. "I've always done my job. Just like everyone else." Gerald shook his head, his lips twitching in what might have been a semblance of a smile. "No, Mara. You're not fine. You're pushing yourself too hard. And I don't want to see you burn out. It's not worth it." Her fists clenched at her sides. She had worked for him for decades, given her sweat and blood to this company, and he was talking to her like she was some kind of charity case. The anger flared up in her, but she forced herself to swallow it down. "I'm not here for your pity," she said, the words bitter in her mouth. "I don't need anyone to tell me what to do." Gerald took a step closer, his eyes softening slightly, though there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. "I'm not offering pity, Mara. I'm offering a solution. You don't need to do this to yourself anymore. I have resources, you know. We could find a way to lighten your load." Mara's heart raced again, but this time, it wasn't out of anger. It was confusion, disbelief. What was he saying? Was this some kind of offer? Or was it just another attempt to push her aside, to make her feel worthless? "I don't need your help," she said, her voice strained as she fought to keep the tears from rising. "I've done just fine on my own for all these years." For a moment, Gerald didn't speak. He just watched her, as if weighing her words, looking for something. Then, finally, he spoke, his tone softer, almost regretful. "I've seen you work, Mara. You're a hard worker. But you're not invincible. And I don't want to see you break." Mara felt something in her snap. She was done pretending. Done with the pride that had kept her going all these years. She had worked herself to the bone, all for what? To be looked at like a relic? She wasn't sure anymore. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, her steps heavy, her thoughts whirling. As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to see before: she couldn't keep going like this. The physical toll was too much. The emotional toll was even worse. Mara arrived home that night, her body exhausted in ways it had never been before. She barely made it to the door before Laura rushed to greet her, her face etched with concern. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with worry. Mara didn't respond right away. She just stood there, leaning against the doorframe, her hands gripping the handle for support. For the first time in a long while, she didn't have the energy to lie, to pretend everything was fine. "No," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I'm not okay." Her daughter's arms enveloped her in an embrace, and Mara felt the tears she had been holding back for so long finally spill over. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to break down. And as Laura held her, she realized something else: it was time to stop pretending. Time to stop carrying the weight alone. Time to accept that asking for help didn't mean weakness, it meant strength. The turning point. The days following that evening were a whirlwind for Mara. It was as though the walls she had spent decades building around herself had finally cracked, allowing the flood of emotions she had long suppressed to pour out. At first, it had been overwhelming, feeling everything she had hidden from for so long. But soon, there was a sense of relief, like the weight of the world had been lifted, even if only just a little. Mara spent the next few days contemplating the conversation with Gerald, as well as the raw vulnerability she had shown Laura. It was something she had never done before, not in this way. She was always the one who protected, the one who carried the burdens, the one who held everything together. To allow herself to lean on someone else, to admit she needed help, was foreign to her. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She had spent so many years trying to control everything, believing that her worth was measured by how much she could endure. She had fought through injuries, setbacks, and hardships, convinced that if she could just push a little harder, a little longer, she would eventually earn the life she dreamed of. But in truth, all she had earned was exhaustion, bitterness, and a fractured sense of self. She knew she couldn't keep going this way. She had to make a change, for her sake, and for the sake of her family. A week later, Mara walked into work feeling different. She didn't know how to explain it. Maybe it was the conversations with Laura, or maybe it was the realization that Gerald had been right all along. Whatever it was, she felt a sense of determination she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't ready to throw in the towel, not yet, but she had started to see things from a new perspective. The factory floor felt different that morning, too. The machine still hummed around her, the air still thick with the smell of oil, but for the first time, Mara didn't feel swallowed by it all. There was a space within her, a tiny sliver of clarity, that made her realize she wasn't just another cog in the machine. She was more than that. She went through her workday in a kind of quiet focus, no longer rushing to finish, no longer frantic to meet impossible expectations. She didn't let the weight of her responsibilities suffocate her anymore. She allowed herself small moments of pause, just a few seconds here and there to breathe, to think, to reset. Her shift ended as usual, and she made her way toward the break room, planning to take her lunch in peace. But when she walked in, she saw something unexpected. There, sitting at one of the tables, was Gerald Grant. His suit was immaculate, his usual polished appearance in stark contrast to the grime of the factory. But what caught her attention most was the look on his face. He was staring down at a small pile of paperwork in front of him, his brow furrowed in thought, but there was something different about him, too. There was a vulnerability in his posture, an openness that she hadn't seen before. For a moment, she wondered if he was just another businessman who thought he could fix everything with money or power. But when he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, he gestured for her to join him. "Mara," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Can we talk?" Mara hesitated, but then, something inside her shifted again. Maybe it was time to confront this head-on, to understand what he really wanted from her. So, without saying a word, she walked over and sat down across from him. "About what we talked about last week," Gerald began, his eyes earnest. "I've been thinking a lot about it. I've been watching you, Mara. You work harder than anyone else here, and it's clear to me that you've been carrying more than your fair share of the load for a long time. You don't need to do that anymore." Mara tilted her head, confused. "What are you saying?" Gerald sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been trying to find a way to make things easier for you. I know that sounds like an empty offer, but it's not. You're an incredibly valuable part of this company, Mara. You're one of the best workers we have. And I'm willing to make sure you get what you deserve." Mara's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure whether to be suspicious or relieved. "I don't know what you mean." Gerald leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "I'm offering you a position in the office. No more double shifts. No more being on the floor day in and day out. You've earned the opportunity to move up, to work in a role that's less physically demanding and more focused on your expertise." Mara stared at him in disbelief. She didn't know how to respond. She had worked in the factory for decades, this was all she knew. The thought of moving into an office role, of leaving the factory floor, was both terrifying and liberating. I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I've always been a worker. That's who I am." Gerald nodded, understanding. "I get it. But you deserve more than just scraping by. I want you to think about it, Mara. We can make this happen if you want it." For a long moment, Mara sat in silence. Her mind raced as she thought about what this offer meant. The truth was, she was tired, so tired, but she didn't know how to stop. The idea of being something more, of stepping into a new role, felt foreign to her. It was as though she had been living in a world defined by limits and expectations, and now, someone was offering her a chance to break free from all of it. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice more steady now. Gerald gave a small nod of approval. "Take all the time you need." Mara left work that day with a heavy mind but also a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. As she made her way home, she thought about the conversation with Gerald and the possibility of a new future. A future where she didn't have to work herself into the ground. A future where she could focus on something other than survival. That night, she sat down with Laura after dinner, her daughter noticing the change in her demeanor immediately. "Mom, you look like you're thinking about something big," Laura said, her voice hopeful. Mara nodded slowly, her hands wrapped around the cup of tea in front of her. "I think I'm ready to make a change, Laura." "Really?" Laura's eyes widened, a smile spreading across her face. "What kind of change?" "I don't know yet," Mara admitted, "but I think it's time to stop working just to survive. I want something more. And I think Gerald may have just offered me the opportunity to have it." Laura's eyes sparkled with joy. "You deserve it, Mom. You really do." Mara's heart swelled as she looked at her daughter. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the woman she had once dreamed of being, a woman who could live, not just exist. The decision. The days following her conversation with Gerald were filled with uncertainty, but also something else, a quiet sense of empowerment. Mara found herself waking up each morning with a different energy, as though the world had shifted on its axis. The factory still loomed in the distance, its cold, mechanical hum the soundtrack to her daily life, but Mara felt a pull towards something new. Something better. She had never been one to back away from a challenge, but the thought of stepping away from the factory floor, of taking on a new role that didn't involve years of physical labor, was both exhilarating and terrifying. The years of strain on her body had taken their toll, but it was the weight of her pride that made the decision so difficult. Mara had always seen herself as someone who could endure, someone who could survive anything. She had raised her children on the belief that hard work and sacrifice were the paths to success. But what if success could look different? What if her worth wasn't tied to how much she could endure? That night, as Mara sat at the dinner table with Linda and the children, the conversation turned to what had been weighing on her mind for days. "You seem distant, Mom," Linda remarked, eyes narrowing slightly. "What's going on?" Mara set her fork down and took a deep breath. The weight of the moment hung in the air, the silence a precursor to the decision she was about to make. "I had a conversation with Gerald Grant today," she began, her voice steady but her heart racing. Linda raised an eyebrow. "Gerald Grant? The CEO?" Mara nodded. "He offered me a position in the office. A desk job. No more factory floor. No more double shifts. It would mean a change, a big one. I would be leaving the only job I've ever known, but I wouldn't have to struggle so hard anymore. I wouldn't have to risk my health, my time, everything just to survive." Linda's eyes widened. "That's incredible, Mom. Why wouldn't you do it?" Mara's gaze dropped to her plate, the decision still not fully formed in her mind. "It's not that simple, sweetheart. I've worked in that factory my entire life. I know that place like the back of my hand. And I'm not sure who I am without it. I don't know how to just walk away from all those years." Linda reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "You've earned more than just surviving, Mom. You've worked so hard. You deserve to live a life that's easier, better. You deserve to be happy." Mara squeezed her daughter's hand, the words sinking deep into her heart. "I know," she whispered. "But I'm scared." Linda's expression softened. "I understand. But you're not alone in this. I believe in you, and I think this could be the start of something really good for you." For the first time in years, Mara allowed herself to consider the possibility of something different. It wasn't just about the job, or the money, or the recognition, it was about her. It was about her future, and what kind of life she wanted to build for herself and her family. The next morning, after the kids had left for school and Linda had gone to work, Mara found herself standing at the kitchen window, looking out over the small town she had lived in for so long. The streets were quiet, the houses lined up like old friends, each one holding stories of lives lived, of dreams realized and deferred. The factory, just a few miles away, stood as a reminder of what she had worked for, what she had built. But it also stood as a reminder of what she had lost along the way, her health, her sense of self, her peace. She picked up the phone and dialed the number that had been on her mind for days. Gerald's voice, smooth and steady, answered on the third ring. "Mara," he said, sounding pleased. "I'm glad you called. Have you made a decision?" Mara hesitated, the weight of her choice heavy on her shoulders. "I've been thinking about it a lot," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "And I think I'm ready. I want to take the position. I want to make a change." Gerald's voice was warm with approval. "I'm glad to hear that, Mara. I think you'll thrive in this role. You've earned it, and I'll make sure we get everything in place for you to transition smoothly." Mara swallowed the lump in her throat, feeling the gravity of her decision settle in her chest. She had just taken the first step toward a new life, one where she would be able to live with more than just survival in mind. But it wasn't without sacrifice. It wasn't without fear. "Thank you, Gerald," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me this chance." "I'm the one who should be thanking you," he replied. "I've seen your work ethic. You're one of the best we have. This is just the beginning, Mara." Mara ended the call and stared out the window, her heart racing. For the first time in a long time, she felt as though she was standing at the edge of something new, something full of potential and hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face it. The following weeks were filled with paperwork, meetings, and the careful process of transitioning into her new role. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Mara questioned whether she had made the right decision. The factory floor still called to her, its familiarity a comfort she couldn't entirely shake. But with each passing day, she began to see that the life she was building was worth the struggle. Gerald had kept his word. The office was far less physically demanding, and while it came with its own set of challenges, Mara found that she had more energy to give to her family. She was able to spend more time with Linda and the children, enjoying simple moments that had once seemed like luxuries. It wasn't just the physical toll of the factory that Mara had been carrying, it was the emotional weight of years spent sacrificing everything for the sake of survival. Now, she could finally breathe. And as the weeks passed, Mara realized that her decision had not just been about a job. It had been about reclaiming her life. She had taken control of her future, and though it was still uncertain, it was hers to shape. One evening, after a long day in the office, Mara sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea in front of her. She stared out the window, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The factory was still there, but it no longer held the same power over her. She was no longer defined by the work she did. She was defined by something far more important, her own sense of worth. And as she sipped her tea, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had made the right choice. She had chosen to live.